is really tying everything that we've been talking about together. We've started the conversation with the central nervous system, really zooming in on the neuron, you know, the excitability of the neuron, the action potential. Then we talked about the synapse. And so now we're going to sort of step back and talk about the nervous system on a whole from a structural and functional perspective. So let's start off by talking about the cells of the neuron, the central nervous system. Oops, hang on. Okay. So talking about the central nervous system on a whole, this is really the brain and spinal cord, and we want to distinguish this from the peripheral nervous system. So the peripheral nervous system is everything outside of brain and spinal cord. Now, the central nervous system, really important for homeostasis for obvious reasons, right? If we think about some of the types of variables that are regulated as a part of homeostasis, blood pressure, pH, temperature, the way that those signals or changes are picked up is via the nervous system. And then the way that the changes, the regulatory changes that would correct those variables, the instructions for those changes are sent on neurons, right? So from the higher centers down to those effector tissues, and then from the sensory structures up to the higher centers and brainstem. And so the nervous system is really this highway of communication that's super important for the maintenance of homeostasis. There are many, many neurons, billions of neurons, creating many, many synapses, trillions of synapses. And this is responsible for pretty much everything we do, think, feel, perceive. It's really hard to make this connection, but things like our memories, our emotional state of being, our mood, these are all controlled by neurons and neurochemical substances, hormones and neurotransmitters. And so it's really important to understand that this really controls, this is like the CPU of the body. This is also the least understood system. So we don't really understand the brain the way that we do many other systems like the heart, the lungs, etc. And so it's one of the poorest understood systems, the brain, the central nervous system in the brain. Let's look at some of the players here and some of the topics that we're going to talk about. So we'll talk about the neurons. These are basically the functional units of the nervous system. We'll talk about the glial cells. These are the supporting cells that help the neurons do their job pretty much. We've also got the physical supporting structures, things like the meninges and the skull, which we kind of talked about in lab, so I'm not going to go into too much detail as far as those structures go. We also touched on blood supply in lab, but we'll kind of expand on the conversation, talk a little bit about metabolism, and then we'll talk about the blood-brain barrier and then gray matter versus white matter. So the neuron is both the structural and functional unit of the nervous system. This is kind of where all the magic happens throughout the nervous system. The functions are to respond to chemical and physical stimuli. They're also going to conduct electrical impulses. So all of the action potential conduction that we've been speaking about, the synaptic transmission that we've been speaking about, all that happens at the level of the neuron. It's also going to help release chemical regulators. So those are the neurotransmitters, and as well as just send signals about pretty much everything we do, from the movement of muscle, again, the formation of memories, our ability to learn, our autonomic nervous system, so glandular secretion, reproductive function, GI coordination, all of that happens with the help of neurons in the nervous system. Interestingly, neurons cannot divide, so they cannot replicate as well as other cells can, muscle cells and so on. But they can repair themselves to some degree. To what degree is a bit of a controversy. There's some school of thought that think neurons do not generally repair themselves well. So if you have a nerve injury, it's really hard to heal. And then there's other schools of thought that think that there are some cells that do help neurons repair, such as the glial cells, and we'll talk about that. So we can classify neurons based upon two different qualifications. We can talk about the structural classifications. This is basically how many processes extend from a neuron. And by this classification, we can have unipolar neurons, pseudopolar neurons, multipolar neurons. But the more important classification, and one that we'll be looking at more, is the functional classification of neurons. So basically what they do or how they function differently. So we have sensory neurons, motor neurons. These are usually in the peripheral nervous system. And then we also have interneurons, which help to bridge the communication between sensory and motor neurons. And these are usually found in the central nervous system. And again, to clarify here, when we talk about central nervous system versus peripheral nervous system, central nervous system is brain, spinal cord, peripheral nervous system is everything else. So let's look at the functional classification here of neurons. This is based on what direction impulses are being sent in. So sensory neurons are conducting impulses towards the sensory nervous system. So they're picking up information, again, about the world around us. Think sight, think sound, think olfactory information, think tactile information, information about touch. All that information is transmitted towards the central nervous system on sensory neurons. We then have motor neurons, which are conducting impulses in the opposite direction. So these are basically sending information, instructions, again, really important for homeostasis, to our glands, our muscles, and other effector tissues. So think about movement of skeletal muscle, movement of autonomic or glandular secretion, movement of autonomic or smooth muscle, movement of the heart, right? Increasing the heart rate, decreasing the heart rate. Those types of signals are sent on motor neurons. So we have two types of motor neurons. We've got somatic motor neurons that are really in control of skeletal muscle. This we have voluntary control over. We can think about which muscles to move, how to move our face, mouth, legs, hands, etc. Whereas the signals sent on autonomic neurons go out to smooth muscle, think GI, think urinary muscles, think reproductive muscles, think blood vessels, right? Smooth muscles help to line blood vessels, cardiac muscle, and then glands as well. And so autonomic signals are not voluntarily controlled by us, right? We don't have a say or a decision to make as far as speeding up the heart rate, decreasing the heart rate, etc. And then we've got the interneurons, sometimes called the association neurons. These help to bridge the communication between somatic or motor neurons and sensory neurons. And these are usually within the central nervous system. So usually found within the brain and spinal cord. So here are some examples of those association neurons or those interneurons, which help to bridge the motor and sensory communication. All right, let's speak about the glial cells now. So most of the central nervous system is composed of what we call neuroglia. Neuroglia is really the neurons together with all of the glial cells that offer support to those neurons. Now, glial cells are not excitable. The only excitable cells in the central nervous system are the neurons themselves. And so glial cells function in other roles that are supportive and regulatory and even protective of the neurons themselves. So here's kind of an overview of all of the cells that we'll speak about, but we'll talk about them in some more detail. So I'll just point them out here. We have the ependymal cells, which help to line the ventricular cavities, also important in producing CSF. We've got the neurons themselves, so these are not a part of the glial cells. Other part of the glial cells are the astrocytes, these star-shaped cells, really important in the blood-brain barrier. We'll talk about what that is and why it exists. There are also oligodendrocytes that help to myelinate within the central nervous system versus Schwann cells that help to myelinate outside of the central nervous system, so in the peripheral nervous system. So yeah, here are the 5 cells. So astrocytes, several different functions. We'll talk about some of those. Ependymal cells. Microglia are the immune cells of the central nervous system. These help to break down old debris cells, remove any toxins, bacteria, pathogens, etc. And then the 2 myelinating cells, which we'll talk about as well. So let's start out by looking at astrocytes. And astrocytes, as their name suggests, are these star-shaped cells that are really important in different aspects of connection between the nervous tissue and non-nervous tissue. So as you can see in this image here, the way that they are shaped with these foot processes or these extensions from the central part of the cell, these extensions help to create what's called the blood-brain barrier. And this is really a protective barrier against any toxins, bacteria, viruses, pathogens, drugs that may be in the vascular system, and protect the central nervous system tissue, the neurons, from exposure to some of those toxins and pathogens, etc. So it's really a way to protect the nervous tissue. We'll see this in another system, in the testes. And so because there can be all sorts of, molecules and metabolites in the blood, one way to prevent those types of substances from getting into the nervous system is the presence of the astrocytes forming that barrier. Now, astrocytes also help possibly with modulation of the synaptic activity. So we talked about presynaptic facilitation and presynaptic inhibition. And so it's thought that astrocytes can play that modulatory or that modulating role at the synapse as well. And then they help to communicate signals. So they also help the neurons conduct or relay transmission of neurotransmitters, which is to help them communicate their signals. Astrocytes also kind of clean up the synaptic cleft. They help to remove excess neurotransmitter from the junction, especially toxic neurotransmitters. So lots of glutamate. We talked about glutamate being an excitatory neurotransmitter. And so excess glutamate at the junction can be quite toxic to the nervous system. And so helping to clear away that is one of the roles of astrocytes as well. They help to maintain the electrolyte level in the interstitial fluid around the central nervous tissue, especially the level of potassium in that fluid. They also protect the nervous tissue against oxidative stress, and again, any toxic metabolites. Think about the breakdown products of drugs or toxins that we may be exposed to environmentally, and really protect the nervous tissue from that type of exposure. Another role that astrocytes play is glycogen synthesis. So the nervous tissue cannot store glycogen very well. And so the ability to produce glycogen and produce a backup reserve of energy for the brain is going to be done by astrocytes, and they have a limited ability to produce or provide some glycogen synthesis. Now, microglia, we want to associate microglia with the immune function of the nervous system. They help to protect the neurons, again, from toxic exposure, but they play a more active role in this process. They have what's called a phagocytic ability. So they have the ability to actually engulf bacteria or swallow or break down debris, dead or dying, injured cells, bacteria, pathogens, etc. And so they play a more active role in an immune response as far as protecting the nervous tissue from toxic exposure and from pathogens. Now, on the note of speaking about these glial cells, we can make a few clinical connections here. Let's talk about some of the neurodegenerative diseases. So multiple sclerosis is one neurodegenerative disease. This is where we have a loss of myelin in the nervous system, specifically the central nervous system. And we'll talk about the cells that are responsible there, the oligodendrocytes. And so when we lose the myelin in the central nervous system, the types of symptoms that present are usually visual disturbances, because the optic nerve is one of the important myelinated nerves. We also see overall paralysis because of loss of myelin in different areas of the brain or the spinal cord. And so multiple sclerosis is one neurodegenerative disease that's caused by that loss of myelin. We can also speak about Alzheimer's disease. This is another disease, a loss of cholinergic neurons, or neurons that produce or release acetylcholine. And this is replaced by plaque tissue or scar tissue. And so Alzheimer's disease, I'm sure many of you have heard of it in some way or other, it's pretty common, is really a neurocognitive decline. So these patients lose their ability to do pretty much everything. It's almost like aging in reverse. They lose their memory initially. That's kind of the way the disease presents. It's very progressive. And so they eventually lose other functions, so the ability to swallow and eat and talk, and eventually results in death. Now, we cannot reverse Alzheimer's disease, but we can slow it down. And so it's a really Impactful disease as far as aging is concerned. And again, a lot is not understood about it, but we do know that there's a loss of these specific types of neurons and is associated with the loss of cognitive ability. And then Parkinson's disease, another kind of neurocognitive dysfunction disorder, is more involved in movement. So this is where we have loss of dopaminergic neurons, and dopaminergic neurons are important for movement. And so we see persons with Parkinson's usually have a very shuffling gait. You may have seen someone with this where they're kind of dragging their feet on the floor, and that's typical of Parkinson's disorder, but it's also associated toward the end stage of the disease with neurocognitive dysfunction as well. So the inability to remember things or create new memories, as well as some other behavioral dysfunction as well.